Hey everyone, it's David Chen here with a quick review of Spiral from the Book of Saw, which is the latest Saw film that's out in theaters right now. It's the 9th Saw film, and I've actually seen all the Saw movies. I'm somewhat of a fan. They're a guilty pleasure of mine. So I'm going to be talking about how Spiral stacks up with the rest of the series and the franchise. Now, when I saw that Chris Rock was going to be involved, I was really intrigued. Like, what was going to be the take that Chris Rock brought to this franchise? Apparently he was a fan of the Saw films, and so I was really interested to see whether he would add any of his signature humor to the film. And the answer to that question is kind of. Spiral deviates from the Saw formula in a couple of key ways. First of all, it's primarily a police procedural, and most Saw films are told from the perspective of the people in the traps as well as the police who are trying to track them down. Maybe later you learn that those things are happening at different times, but it's usually like these two halves that make the whole of a Saw film, for the most part. And this movie is mostly from the perspective of the police, who are trying to track down a Jigsaw copycat that is taking out corrupt cops. So that's another big difference, is like, Jigsaw killer that's taking out corrupt cops. That might be an interesting mix on the formula. Now, the second big difference is you got Chris Rock and Samuel L. Jackson in this movie. Chris Rock plays a detective. Samuel L. Jackson plays his father, a former police chief. And these two bring undeniable star power to the franchise. I'm pretty sure they're like the highest profile actors to ever be in this series. And they're obviously both enormously talented. It's a delight to see them together. You're hoping that like maybe they'll share a bunch of scenes together, or it's going to be a two-hander with the two of them. Not the case, unfortunately. They're in the movie together for maybe 4 or 5 scenes, and that's a big downside. Speaking of which, one of the big problems of this movie, in my opinion, is that like Chris Rock doesn't really have enough of a chance to be Chris Rock. Like, Chris Rock is a hilarious, insightful comedian, and he does have an occasional chance to deliver some monologues, musing about daily life today. He has some good one-liners in there. There's a monologue about Forrest Gump that I thought was really awesome. But I just really didn't feel like this franchise added as much humor that I think was in Chris Rock's vision for this. Because after some initial humorous portions about, again, Forrest Gump and, marriage and relationships and stuff like that, the movie kind of reverts to its old habits. It's just kind of in its own formula and just doing the thing that it's used to doing. And that's not a bad thing if you're a Saw fan. This movie is directed by Darren Lynn Bousman, who directed several of the Saw films, arguably helped to create the template for most of the franchise. So people who liked older Saw films will probably find a lot to enjoy here. But if you were looking for something that was going to bring in new fans, I don't know that this does it, because I don't know that it has enough of Chris Rock being Chris Rock, which is something that I actually really enjoy seeing. And while we're on the topic of longtime fans, let me just go on a series of useless rants for you, okay? Here's just some rants I have about the Saw franchise. Rant number 1, I think that the Saw films were way, way more interesting when the traps were about teaching people moral lessons, right? And it's like, you must like remove this key from this guy's belly and prove that you have the will to kill people if you want to live. It's like, okay, I'm not sure that really is a good moral lesson, but at least it's an ethos. And as the Saw films went on, they became less about teaching lessons and more about just straight up torturing people and killing them. And that was actually one of the subplots of one of the earlier Saw films, was like the traps were too hard to get out of. In this movie, the traps are basically impossible to get out of. And this is kind of a bummer, because I think it's just more interesting when like you're posing a dilemma to someone and they need to decide something. And now it's just torture porn, which is not what the creators of the franchise really wanted this to be. So that's kind of a shame. The second thing I want to mention is that I think this movie uses a lot of very loaded imagery, but I don't know what the movie is trying to say with it. And I can't really say more without revealing spoilers, which I'm not going to reveal during this review. But I'll just say, if you watch it all the way to the end, I think you'll probably know what I'm talking about. And it's kind of tough to watch without really the movie taking a stance on what it's saying. And I'll just leave it at that. The other thing I'm going to say is they replaced the voice of Jigsaw, who was brought to life so vividly in the earlier Saw films, by Tobin Bell. Now, a different character is obviously playing the Jigsaw copycat killer. And the new voice, I'm just going to say, is pretty lame. It kind of sucks.
Hello, Detective Boswick. I want to play a game.
The old voice is iconic. This one, pretty lame, not scary sounding at all. I was actually kind of wondering, like, is this a parody of some kind? So anyway, just a minor point there. All right, so should you watch Spiral from the Book of Saw? By the way, there's no book. I think it's just a more pretentious way of saying sequel. Should you watch it? I think this is not the worst Saw film by far. There are way worse Saw films. Saw 3D, aka Saw the Last Chapter, is like very, very bad. And this movie, I would say, is like mid-tier Saw, you know, probably at the lower end of mid-tier Saw. There are a lot of problems with it. I mean, a lot of the acting seems pretty rough. It feels like they did like the first take of a lot of things, or the second take of a lot of things, and it just doesn't feel quite as polished. There's not that much stuff with the traps. The traps aren't as elaborate and interesting as in earlier films. But you got Chris Rock and Samuel L. Jackson in a Saw movie, and that's inherently kind of interesting to see what those characters will bring to this franchise. A lot of people already know. So I would say if you're a Saw fan, I'd give this like a 7.5 out of 10. If you are just a general horror fan, maybe 2 to 3 out of 10. Probably best to just skip it. But I thought it was good enough to hold my interest throughout the film, but just barely. Anyway, those are my thoughts on Spiral from the Book of Saw. Let me know what you thought of this movie. Was it a worthy entry into the franchise? Is it going to reboot interest in Saw? Or should they just stick a fork in this thing? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to hit like or subscribe. Hit that bell icon to make sure you receive updates whenever I post a new video. Thanks to all my patrons at patreon.com/DaveChen for supporting my work. We'll see you in the next one.